Hello, my name is Jenna Cassell, and welcome to our program entitled Viewpoints. If you're interested in learning about deaf culture and increasing your ASL receptive skills, this is the program for you. We're lucky to have 6 deaf people who have been willing to share their experiences and opinions and viewpoints on this program. As the host, I asked each of these individuals a series of questions which they then answered, and you will be able to improve your ASL receptive skills and learn in the process. If you'd like to increase your challenge, you can turn the volume off and not listen to the interpretation provided. But don't worry, if you need help along the way, you can always turn the volume back on and listen to the interpretation on the video. If you're ready to begin, let's dive in. Good luck. Interpreter's question 1. As a consumer of interpreters, there are many times you can use interpreters, such as for doctors or lawyers, but when do you use interpreters and when do you decide not to use interpreters? This is Brenda's response. I was very embarrassed in the past with the idea of using interpreters for a medical appointment. I would prefer to write notes back and forth. But I actually used an interpreter at one point. Of course, it was a woman, but I realized I got more information from the doctor than in the past when I decided to, when I was just using note writing back and forth. Of course, I'd want the interpreter to be confidential and not share information that they came upon during this appointment. But I'm trying to think, when I would not use an interpreter. Maybe if it was a routine appointment, such as for maybe paying a ticket or something like that. If it was just a brief encounter, I wouldn't mind writing notes back and forth with the other party. But if it was an important matter, such as a business meeting or work-related, I will always use an interpreter. Now, I don't tend to use family members as interpreters. I remember one time my husband asked me to go to a movie that wasn't captioned, and he said he'd be willing to interpret for me. Now, I should tell you, he's a hearing guy, my husband, but we started watching the movie and he began to interpret, and I was looking at his interpreting, and I noticed people around us laughing hysterically, and I didn't find anything of funny about the movie from what he was interpreting. I certainly wasn't impressed, but then, interesting, later that movie was available uncaptioned, so I started watching it and I started laughing hysterically, and I realized, oh my goodness, my husband missed all of this. Now, maybe a brief kind of a thing, sure, I might use him, but maybe something more in depth, like a financial advisor, that kind of a meeting, no. I remember I had that experience with him, and he would, just try to slow things down. He was not really getting things and was trying to get clarification, was making sure he understood, and then I realized, look, this was not working. I would rather have a professional interpreter in that kind of a situation. This is Ed's response. I tend not to use interpreters. I'd rather not depend. I don't really tend to like to depend on other people. Even doctors or attorneys, those kinds of appointments, if they have a little bit of sign especially, or if I can read their lips, I would prefer not to use an interpreter. Now, if it was a surgical procedure or something more serious, I would use an interpreter for that kind of encounter. I will use interpreters for some things like where there are more than 2 of us, like a business meeting or a lecture or something like that, because I want to have clear dialogue with the audience or vice versa. And if it was just a one-on-one situation, I prefer to go without. Now, I've had both positive and negative experiences with using interpreters. For example, I remember I have taken university courses at different colleges, Cal State LA or Cal State Northridge. Sometimes interpreters are put into situations, into lectures where they have no idea of the subject matter in that particular course, and I would prefer to do completely without an interpreter unless I was going to get an interpreter who is an expert in the background knowledge in that field. Sometimes, it seems that often universities are placing interpreters into situations or into classes and lectures where they have no background knowledge, no expertise in the field, and they're not staying on point with the information being conveyed, whether it's science or a computer class, you name it. It just is very frustrating when that happens. In that case, I would prefer that the interpreter just transliterate into English and allow me to do the interpretation, and I find that leads to much less misunderstanding and miscommunication. This is Marilyn's response. Now, I tend to use interpreters mostly for my work, for meetings or workshops or trainings or some things like that. Sometimes I feel like the quality is very important. I want to make sure that the interpreter understands everything. I don't want miscommunication. I don't want them off point. I want them to follow what I say and follow what everybody else is saying too. I mean, it's hard to find good interpreters, I find, for my work. I really find that that's a challenge. This is Mark's response. I use interpreters quite often in my job with the state. I travel around and I tend to provide training lectures, and so my interpreters generally are voicing what I am signing into English for the audience that I'm presenting to. In the past, I would use interpreters more for college courses and workshops, and interpreters would be providing the information into ASL for me, or be voicing my questions if I had them in those classes. So in the past, I used interpreters more for voice to sign. Now I'm using interpreters more for sign to voice. They're interpreting for me into English. I really feel like I want interpreters to be able to match any subtle shifts in my presentation. Sometimes I'll be presenting and I might even change what I have been talking about before with that interpreter, so they really have to be up to speed with me. If I decide to change things, they need to be able to pick that up. I've noticed quite a few, or not quite a few, but a select few of interpreters who have that ability. And maybe I will decide at some point to go back to school and I'll need an interpreter to be providing interpretation primarily into ASL for me. I'm wondering if I'll be able to do it. I don't know. It might be a rusty situation for me. We'll have to see how it goes. It'll be an interesting experience and challenge. Now Ginny's saying, I've used interpreters or needed interpreters sometimes for doctors or business meetings. I find that generally, to be honest, I don't use them. I prefer to just write notes back and forth with people. I find that that's what I've generally been doing, and I'm much happier without interpreters. If an interpreter could understand what was going on, then I certainly would be open to using one. This is David's response. I tend to use interpreters, well, to be honest, not so often. Actually, maybe two situations, in education and in medical situations. For education, I'm a teacher, so I will be going to different workshops and they'll bring interpreters in. It's very important to have one as a bridge between what I'm wanting to say and what other people are saying in the workshop. So that's one thing. Now, it's important also in the second type of situation, medical situation, that I have an interpreter. I used to just depend on writing notes back and forth with the doctor, but now the law says that interpreters should be provided or must be provided in this situation, so I use them. And I noticed that actually it's much nicer because it takes a lot less time than it used to with writing notes back and forth, and I find it helpful. Now, I'm trying to think when I would not use an interpreter. Maybe if it was a very personal matter, if it was something I was concerned the interpreter would not keep confidential, that might be something that I would prefer to just do without an interpreter. That's one thing that comes to mind. This is question 2. Now, in your experience using interpreters, there are times when you've had interpreters that have been excellent and have been very smooth in the delivery of services, and other times, I'm sure, when that has not been the case, when there has been lots of misunderstanding and miscommunication with your experience using an interpreter. What of those two types of situations sticks in your mind, in your experience? Now, Ed's answer to the question is coming. Well, a good example for me might be when an interpreter misinterprets my meaning. So I feel like I need to find expert interpreters for when I teach courses at the college. I've found 2, Lou Font and Lori, someone I'd have to clarify the name as the interpreter, but those are interpreters that have been very, very highly skilled for me. I do remember one thing. I remember when I was in graduating, the graduation celebration or the graduation ceremony for my PhD, when I was awarded my PhD. A friend of mine who was there, who was a very novice interpreter at the time, wanted to try to interpret for me while I was speaking with my faculty advisor at this celebration. So he came up and began his interpreting. I introduced my friend as him as my friend, and I introduced his wife, and then he began interpreting, and he voiced that this person, his wife, was my wife. And my advisor said, "What? I didn't even know you were married, and I've known you for 5 years." So there's an example of one thing, that where I might have preferred a professional interpreter rather than just a friend who is trying out his skills. What I was saying now, in my work with the federal government, I remember going into it was actually my first time using interpreters. Prior to that, had only been around people who knew how to sign. It was a very different experience. I know people have to follow the code of ethics, and there are different certification levels. And I wasn't really used to the type of interpreters I was getting in these jobs as compared to what I had in the past. I've had interpreters that were good, some not, and I would be attending different workshops, and I would decide, it's better than nothing as long as I have an interpreter. But then at one time, I had this interpreter who was amazing. I just had the experience of being so clearly understood and feeling like they understood what was going on so clearly. And at that point I realized, boy, I have the right to the best interpreters, and I don't need an interpreter who's going to make mistakes and have errors occur during these work-related meetings. I wouldn't say it's a bad experience, but it's certainly been great to have that kind of interpreter now that I know I deserve it. Mark saying, I actually, just a bit ago, met two interpreters who were studying interpreting, and I asked them, what does interpreting mean? And they described what they thought it meant from their perspective, which was very interesting for me to learn about, and it actually got me thinking about things. And I actually asked them, well, how do you interpret? How do you go from one language, a visual language like ASL, to a spoken language and vice versa? They explained the process to me, and it was very interesting to me to hear that. They gave me a lot of examples of speaking English and how that would be conveyed in sign language, and it helped me understand better what interpreting was like. And I've had a few times when interpreting didn't go so well. I remember lecturing, and I would be going on, and I actually got toward the end of my lecture, and the interpreter realized, oh my goodness, I've gone completely off the point of your lecture, and they had to take a break and excuse themselves and repeat and clarify and catch up with what the actual interpretation should have been, and had to completely backtrack. That was one screw up. I kind of wish, I'm actually I'm happy that they took that responsibility on themselves to say it was their fault when they did the repair. So that was a good part of that negative experience. Brenda's saying, oh yes, yes indeed, actually let me explain first before I talk about my experiences. In my work, I go to professional development sometimes, and I remember being in a big audience with all this big red screen. I think it was for Verizon, and the interpreter showed up with a bright red lipstick and bright red clothing and bright red nail polish, and as she began her interpreting, it made me downright dizzy to watch her. And I asked her, could you please, take a break and maybe tone down the lipstick or something? It's just too much for me. She had jewelry on. It was just very distracting. It was very hard for me to watch in this particular venue. And she said, oh, of course, I'd be willing to do that. She went off and with a friend and came back to resume her interpreting, and the same situation, the lipstick, and hold on.